Hello, our word today is interpret, and the same as with our other videos, we'll start by storing a pattern of how the word sounds. Interpret, interpret. We can whisper it, interpret. We can shout it, interpret. We can repeat it, interpret. And you may also find the British Sign Language sign for interpret helpful, which is this, interpret, interpret. That might help you to remember the word and connect the meaning to it. So what does interpret mean? Well, if I have a look in my dictionary, it explains that interpret is when we decide on the meaning of something. We decide what it means. It's your interpretation. So if I look at a jar of Marmite like this and I go, your interpretation is probably that I think Marmite is pretty disgusting. But then if I looked at some chocolate like this and went, your interpretation might be that I think chocolate is delicious. And another way that you might hear the word interpret is if there's an interpreter, and an interpreter is someone who translates a language. So if I said bonjour, comment allez-vous, which is French, an interpreter would translate that into English by saying it means hello, how are you? In school or in television, you might also see sign language interpreters, and they translate what is spoken, what's said, into sign language. So if a teacher said open your book, the interpreter might sign something like that. So let's have a look at what interpret means in a bit more detail using our word map. So there's our word written, interpret. We'll start as we always do, read what we said. We know that it begins with in, and it has 3 syllables. Interpret begins with in, interpret. So read what you said. We'll move on to thinking about the meaning of the word. Green for what we mean. And we've talked about one meaning of interpret, meaning when something is translated. For example, translating bonjour into hello. So that's one meaning about translation. Another one is often when we're asked to interpret something, we're being asked to decide what it means. Decide what something means. Decide how we understand it. When we're trying to understand it, you might hear people talk about making sense of something. When they're interpreting something, they're often trying to make sense of it. And also when you're interpreting something, you're trying to decide what it means, you're looking at what's important or what's significant about it. So often when we're interpreting, we're trying to decide what something means, to make sense of it and understand what's important, what's significant. For our picture, if you think back to the sign in British Sign Language, then we'll copy that. I have my person here. And think back about how their arms go round each other in a kind of circle, trying to work something out, make sense of it, understand it. Thinking about how we use the word blue for how we use. Well, we might talk about the interpreter translating something. The interpreter translated what the teacher said. Maybe they translated it into sign language. You might also have to interpret something in science or maths. Let's think about a graph like this. And this is a graph about pets and pets that are owned. So maybe you ask around school and 300 people have a pet cat. But only 200 people have a pet dog. So 300 cats, 200 dogs. You might explain that my interpretation of that, my understanding of that, is that cats are a more popular pet than dogs. Your interpretation of the graph is that cats are more popular as a pet than dogs. And finally, we'll think about grey for another way. Other ways that you might hear or read that word. Well, if you're asked to interpret something, you will have interpreted it. You'll have interpreted it. You will have completed an interpretation. Like your interpretation of the graph was that cats were a more popular pet than dogs. And finally, we've talked about how in school or on television you might see an interpreter who interprets one language into another. And there is our word map for interpret. So let's have a look at what interpret means using some examples. I think that will be helpful. Firstly, watch this video. Try and interpret what the person in it is thinking and what they're feeling. So my interpretation was that she was excited about something. She was hoping for something, and then when it happened or she heard the news, it was even better than she was expecting. Do you think the same? Do you have the same interpretation? So now let's look at this graph. So this shows how many people use different forms of social media, and you could interpret this in lots of ways. You could interpret it as showing that millions and millions, billions even, of people use some form of social media. You could also interpret it as showing that the most popular social media platforms are Facebook and YouTube. You could also interpret it by working out that if you added up all of these users, it comes to about 9 billion, so more people than there are in the whole world. So from that we could interpret, we could understand that millions and millions and millions of people must use more than one form of social media. Okay, so we've started learning about interpret. What could you interpret over the coming week? Maybe try turning the sound off when you're watching the TV. Can you interpret by looking at the people on the TV, what they're thinking, what they're feeling? Can you interpret what's happening without hearing the sound? Maybe you could carry out a survey. You could ask people about their favourite pets or their favourite computer games and then interpret the findings. What was most popular? And how about interpreting paintings and art? Look at this famous picture by Edvard Munch called The Scream. What's your interpretation of this? What is the picture saying? What is it trying to tell you? What is your interpretation? But just a final point. Sometimes your interpretation of something might be different to someone else's interpretation. Sometimes there might be more than one interpretation. Look at this picture. What's your interpretation of what the baby wants? Does it want a cuddle? Does it want its mummy? Does it want some milk? Maybe it wants all of those. But different people might interpret the picture in different ways. Okay, happy interpreting, and I'll see you soon.